Hi, welcome to my talk. Thanks to the symposium organizers for inviting me. I'll tell you a little bit about how we've been thinking about how learned long-term knowledge impacts your ability to hold information in working memory. Okay, so to start with, let's just acknowledge that it is in fact easier to remember things that you have long-term memories associated with. So as opposed to random letters, it's easier to remember things that group into words like tree. It's also harder to remember random colors inside of each other than colors that make an egg. It's harder to remember things that are non-face shapes than things that make a face out of the same shapes, and harder to remember scrambled objects than real objects. And one of the core questions about working memory is why this is true, why it should be that holding information actively in mind depends on what we have in long-term memory. Now, the traditional way of thinking about this, the most common view in the field, in my view, is something like this. It says, well, when you start perceiving these, you start by thinking about them as, your visual system first thinks about them as orientations, and then from there you combine them into letters. And if they're random letters and they have no relationship to each other, then what your working memory system does is effectively try to hold active each of those letter representations separately. So here visualize this, your working memory set representations sort of pointing at those activations. By contrast, if it's a meaningful set of letters, the same thing initially happens. Your visual system starts by processing it as orientations and then letters, but then there's another level of abstraction that's possible, right? You recognize that's tree, and that connects to your concept of tree. And now if you want to hold that in working memory, you can effectively get by with just one pointer to the concept of tree, and then use that to decode what letter was where, if I ask you what the third letter was, for example. And this kind of story dates back a long way. For example, this is something like what Miller had in mind when he said there was a fixed number of chunks, although not quite this well specified. So for example, in Miller's original data, he pointed out that, people can remember about the same number of letters and words, even though for a computer, say, that's deeply different than how a computer works. And this is, of course, totally compatible with that kind of view, because you've got 4 pointers you could point towards words, or 4 pointers you could point toward trees. And of course the version I'm espousing here has a lot more in common with more modern models like the embedded processes model and others that have a similar flavor to this idea. Now this is all in the domain of verbal stimuli, but of course the same thing is true for object stimuli. So for example, if we think about how you might remember a set of 3 arbitrary colored pairs versus 3 realistic color pairs, the arbitrary ones you're going to have to use sort of 2 pointers, one for the yellow and one for the red. Whereas this view sees that, you could say, oh, well, I recognize this as an egg, and store just 1 pointer to an egg. Similarly, this classical view can account for things like learning. Like, for example, if you start with arbitrary pairs that you have to code separately as yellow and red, but then you repeat them over time so that, like we did in this experiment in 2009, yellow and red frequently co-occur. People might at some point extract a yellow-red chunk, and then they can switch to encoding this in working memory as just 1 chunk instead of 2 separate colors. And so this view broadly can be helpful to think about how knowledge impacts working memory and holding things in working memory. And the idea is effectively just that you can store abstractions, so you can get rid of the color and store only the abstraction, a sort of pointer to long-term memory idea. In this talk, I'll call this the content-free view, and the content-free part is sort of implicit in a lot of models here. It's sometimes made explicit, like this is, for example, one paper. The content-free part says, look, there's this chunk and you drop the perceptual details. You only store the abstraction. You don't store all the things within it. What working memory stores is just a pointer to long-term memory. So if you need to decode it, you have to reach into long-term memory and decode it from there. You're not actively storing all the constituent parts. So content-free. And like I said, this has all sorts of positives, this view. Captures all sorts of patterns, right? It explains why we can remember the same number of words as letters, why we're better with stimuli we have knowledge about. It can even account for learning, like we saw in that last slide. But one thing that's always struck me is that this view to me feels really deeply impoverished compared to what it feels to me like remembering an object is like. Like, for example, that view says that effectively all we remember about this plate is, there was an egg, an avocado, and a strawberry. And if all we store is pointers to those abstract concepts and reconstruct them from long-term memory, it would imply we lose all the details, like the size of the strawberry or the color of the yolk. All that would be gone because all we would have is a pointer to like strawberryness. And for scenes, I think this is even more difficult to understand how this could be the way it works. If you just imagine taking this scene of my two daughters in a pumpkin patch, it was just Halloween, and think about storing just a single set of 4 pointers to concepts to capture that, it feels too impoverished. What we're really storing here seems like a schema, representation of what the kind of place it is, the set of objects, the actions taking place, the details of the objects, all embedded together in some representation that captures all of that at once. And so we've been thinking about a sort of alternative viewpoint that suggests that just like our visual system is hierarchical, and just like that scene has a hierarchical representation, what's really stored in working memory is not a pointer to long-term memory that can be decoded, but instead the whole hierarchy of representations of an image or object. So for example, for this non-face, all you can really store is shape information, like what orientations are where, and that could be your working memory representation. But for this stimulus, you can of course store the same shape information, but also realize it's a face and a man with glasses and a heavy chin, and store additional features. You can basically recruit new features for meaningful stimuli. And so this idea that what you're storing in working memory is not just a pointer to, hey, that was a face, but the whole entire hierarchy is what we'll explore today. Okay, so how can you tell apart these views? This content-free view on the one hand, and this hierarchical storage view on the other. Well, they make some differing predictions. One differing prediction is the relative engagement of working memory. So in the content-free view, storing novel things like 2 colors in a pair requires using 2 slots, requires using 2 pointers. Whereas storing an egg requires using only 1 pointer. That is, it's more working memory intensive to store 2 things than 1, and there would be more working memory engagement. By contrast, the hierarchical view rejects the sort of fixed pointer idea and says, in fact, there's more being stored about a face than about a scrambled object, because there's just all these additional features on top. And so there's a contrast in the relative level of working memory engagement you'd predict in these 2 views. The second prediction is about compression. Lossy compression is the prediction of the content-free view, right? Just like I was saying about the strawberry on the plate. That is, if I asked you what color was on the inside of this egg, the content-free view says all you've stored is a pointer to that it was an egg. And so all you can tell me is something like a prototypical egg yolk yellow. You're going to have lost the details because you're only going to have what was in long-term memory, not what was specific to this situation or trial. Whereas the hierarchical view says, well, you're going to store the feature, the actual color, and you're going to scaffold that with the knowledge that it was an egg yolk to help you remember that color. But you're not going to abandon the details. So we decided to test these things. First, I'll start by telling you about the engagement of working memory resources part, and I'll tell you about a little bit of data from a paper we published this year and that I mentioned last year at Psychonomics. In this work, we looked at Mooney faces. These are ambiguous faces that you can sometimes recognize and sometimes not. And we compared them to scrambled matched shapes. So they have the same shapes, but they're not recognizable as faces. And we just had people do a pretty standard working memory paradigm where they had to remember these. And the only trick was that after they were tested on them, they were also asked how many faces did you see? So we could measure both objectively how many faces were present and subjectively how many they perceived. Here's what we found. This is of course consistent with every view of how knowledge improves memory, which is that we found that the more things that were objectively faces as opposed to non-faces, the better people performed. It's easier to remember a face than a non-face. We also found the same thing was true based on subjective perception. So when there were 3 faces, this dark line, if people saw 3, they were better at remembering them than if they saw only 1 as a face. So knowledge does improve working memory in this situation. The question we asked was sort of how much working memory engagement is involved in these situations. And we did that by using electrophysiology to measure how much working memory engagement was happening in each situation. And the 2 accounts make differing predictions here, right? The content-free sort of pure chunking account says that memory is more easily filled up for the non-faces. That is, faces can be encoded with respect to long-term memory, so each basically just takes 1 pointer, right? Just like a tree can be compressed to a single pointer. And so if you had, say, 4 pointers, you'd even have 1 left over. By contrast, the non-faces are a bundle of complex shapes, and so each one might take 2 or even 3 sort of pointers to be able to represent the relevant number of shapes there. And so in many ways, more complex things are just going to take more slots to hold. And so this is the prediction of a chunking count. These are simpler and easier to encode, just like we saw in the prediction slide. By contrast, the hierarchical recruit additional features account says, well, look, these non-faces, you can only store shape information. That's all there is, and so you can store some shape stuff, but nothing else. Whereas for the faces, you can still store shape information, but you can also store face-specific features. So there should be more capacity, there should be more being stored for these. And so you should be able to recruit additional performance. So as I mentioned, we tested this with electrophysiology. And what we found is that when you had 3 faces, as opposed to 1 face and 2 non-faces, you actually observed a larger working memory related brain activity component, the CDA in this case. We found this also for subjective performance. That is, seeing more faces also led to larger CDA. And so it seemed to us this indicates that there's actually more working memory engagement for the faces than the non-faces. This is, of course, consistent with this hierarchical account, that more features have been recruited, but inconsistent with this content-free view that you've compressed it and thrown out the details. The second prediction is about this lossy compression directly, testing it directly, which is the test of whether people know the details of what was inside the chunk. To test this, we did a learning study where we had people try to remember the colors and locations of objects. So you saw objects, then you were probed what color and what object was in this location with a 4AFC. And the trick is that throughout the study, about 80% of the time, the objects appeared in the same colors. That is, backpacks tended to be red, not always, but usually, and chairs tended to be green. And so people should learn that and take advantage of that and remember the colors better because they know which color it was likely to be. They can chunk them together. But the trick is that we varied something trial to trial. That is, we varied luminance trial to trial. So every time they saw every item, it could be any brightness, it could be any luminance. It could be a dark red backpack or a bright pink backpack. So what was predictable that you could chunk was the redness, but the luminance was always random. And then we can test what people know about these items. Most of the time the tests were just, did you know what color it was at all? So learned knowledge would help you here. But sometimes we asked people exactly what color it was. So not only what did you have to know that the stapler was usually yellow, but which yellow it was on this trial. When we gave people regular tests, they of course got better throughout the experiment. This makes sense because they're chunking the colors and objects, and that's improving their memory, right? They're learning backpacks tend to be red, and staplers tend to be yellow, and so they're getting better. That's predicted by all accounts. The relevant question is what happens in these detailed tests. The content-free account predicts that what's happening, what's causing this learning, is that you're learning that stapler was yellow and that you're sometimes storing a pointer to the yellow stapler in your long-term memory, as opposed to storing the details of that stapler. That's what's improving your performance. And so it predicts that performance should actually go down in the detailed condition as you learn. As you learn, you should get better at abstracting to the yellow stapler that you have in long-term memory and lose the details. By contrast, the hierarchical view says that you're just scaffolding with the yellow stapler to help you remember the details that you store also. And so it predicts detailed performance at least stays the same or goes up. What do we find? We find that performance goes up. It certainly doesn't go down. And in different studies, it goes up with different time courses. I don't know why this study looks this way. We can also do this with known chunks. So we can do this with situations where we use the font is the thing that varies trial to trial, and either the letters are randomly paired or they're paired into words. And then we ask people about both the font and the letter. And of course, all accounts predict that when they're grouped into words, the letter themselves should be easier to remember. Was it a G or an M? And that is what we find. That is that the words are easier to remember than the non-words in terms of what letter was present. But again, the content-free account predicts that grouping it into up is going to cause you to lose the font details, whereas the hierarchical account predicts that you're going to be better at the details even when you group it. So what do we find? When we look at font memory, we find that in fact people are better when they're words than when they're non-words. That is, having them be words doesn't cause you to just point to the concept in your memory and lose the details. Instead, it scaffolds memory for the details, like the hierarchical view predicts. Okay, so in both of these cases, I think we find evidence in favor of the view that people are really preserving the whole hierarchy and storing features at multiple levels of abstraction altogether, as opposed to only pointers to the most abstract level. So in general, we're suggesting that memory really integrates across multiple levels of representation. We don't only store this really abstract pointer. And this, of course, requires abandoning the idea that there's a fixed number of chunks with a fixed amount stored. There's always 4 pointers. That abstraction stops working if you have a whole hierarchy of representations that can be richer or less rich for any given stimulus. It's also useful to point out that formalizations are sort of necessary once you start talking about a whole hierarchy. And so, for example, this kind of integrating across the hierarchy can be formalized nicely with hierarchical Bayes and has been in many related literatures. And in fact, even in working memory, Brad Weibel's lab is thinking about how to think about the whole visual hierarchy as being represented in working memory at once. I think these formalizations are going to be really important. Okay, so thank you very much to everyone involved in this work, to my lab, and just to note that if you want to talk about the second half of that data, Michael is presenting a poster about it, so you should check it out.